Hello, everyone. Welcome back to week 6 of our 10-week study, which is inspired by the J. Mack Stiles book, How Do I Get Started in Evangelism? In this week's teaching, we look at pages 33 through 37 and discuss not assuming the gospel. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, it says, "What you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." See, Paul knows the best way to guard the gospel. It's to entrust it to others who will faithfully pass it on. And the fact that Paul teaches Timothy to guard the gospel indicates that he also understands that the gospel can be lost. You can protect the gospel or you can lose it. Those are the only two options. Now, the most common way that Christians lose the gospel is by assuming it. And here's what we mean. Christians assume the gospel when they start seeing it as merely the doorway into the Christian life. Once folks walk through that door, the Christian life becomes about living a moral life rather than living a gospel-centered one. And once this happens, we fall into the trap of thinking that nice people who prayed a prayer or responded to an altar call must be Christians. When a church starts assuming the gospel, anyone who shows up at church interested in doing ministry or being part of a community is immediately affirmed as a Christian. C.S. Lewis noted that at one time the word gentleman had a very specific meaning, a man who owned land and had a title. And then over time it came to mean someone who acted like those who owned land and had a title. Eventually, it became a designation on a bathroom door. He went on to explain that the same pattern often happens with the word Christian. Originally, it meant someone who had a personal relationship with Jesus. Over time, it came to mean someone who did Christian things. And nowadays, it designates a political demographic. See, a church that assumes the gospel will often preach sermons that are very heavy on moral imperatives, but give little attention to the person and work of Christ. It will address the entire audience as believers, even if very few in the congregation give evidence of genuine conversion. And over time, an assumed gospel leads to a confused gospel. We confuse external conformity with genuine Christian faith. We confuse basic morality with love for Christ. The cross is treated merely as an example, not the place where God's wrath and love uniquely meet. But it does get worse. The sermon becomes a self-help talk about how to live a better life. All the while, the gospel seems increasingly irrelevant and offensive. Eventually, the gospel is lost, all because the gospel was assumed. And here's how that pattern typically takes place. First, the gospel is proclaimed. Then the gospel is assumed. Third, the gospel is twisted. And then fourth, the gospel gets lost. And I'd like to suggest that the most dangerous part of that pattern is when the gospel is assumed. And that's why Paul instructed Timothy to guard the gospel and to pass it on with care. He didn't want the gospel to be lost. So, what does this have to do with evangelism? Well, one of the best ways to stop an assumed gospel in its tracks is to make sure we are speaking the gospel to Christians and non-Christians alike. So if you really want to be ready for evangelism, start by pointing your fellow members to the gospel. It'll keep you sharp. Plus, you never know who's listening. Our children might be hearing our words, even if we don't notice. So don't assume the gospel. Keep it on your mind and your lips. One of the best ways to guard the gospel is to ensure you have a biblical understanding of conversion. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next section. Remember, the assumed gospel is a slippery slope. Stay vigilant, keep the gospel central, and always be ready to share it with both believers and non-believers alike. I want to thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you with us in the next section where we cover pages 37 to 43 and dive into a biblical understanding of conversion. We'll see you soon. God bless you all.